Snake Pass, a winding road that traversed the Pennine Mountains in northern England, was renowned for its stunning scenery during the day and its terrifying secrets at night. Isolated and surrounded by dense forests, the area had stories that made even the most skeptical individuals avoid driving there after dark. The protagonist couple, Laura and Daniel Hayes, decided to take on the challenge. Young adventurers and mystery enthusiasts, they planned to traverse Snake Pass on a chilly October night. The trip was part of their exploration of haunted locations for the video channel they maintained online, called Mysteries Under the Stars. "If we film something paranormal, the channel will blow up, Laura," Daniel exclaimed, adjusting the phone in the car's dashboard mount. "Or we might blow up from fear," Laura joked, laughing nervously. The clock struck 11:47 p.m. as they entered the road. The full moon shone in the sky, but the thick fog began to swallow the light. As they moved forward, the road seemed to narrow, and the silence of the place was almost palpable, interrupted only by the sound of the car's engine. Laura held the camera, filming the landscape while Daniel drove, when something unusual appeared on the horizon. A white-blue light point was shining in the middle of the road, oscillating as if it were floating. "Do you see that?" Laura asked, pointing the camera. "It must be some reflection or the headlights of another car," Daniel replied, trying to sound calm but gripping the steering wheel tighter. As they approached, the light grew in intensity. Then, as if responding to their approach, the light shot towards the car, floating at an impossible speed. Daniel slammed on the brakes, but the beam enveloped the vehicle in a blinding luminosity. The radio crackled, and the GPS screen went dark. "What's happening?" Laura screamed, the camera shaking in her hands. "I don't know," Daniel replied, turning the key in a desperate attempt to restart the engine, but the car was dead. Silence returned, but it wasn't a normal silence. It was an unsettling void, as if all the sounds of the world had been swallowed. Laura tried to use her phone, but the screen flickered and turned off on its own. Outside, the light vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Daniel got out of the car to investigate, but as he moved a few meters away, Laura saw something that froze her blood. Two small red lights appeared behind him, like glowing eyes in the fog. She screamed, "Daniel, come back!" Daniel stopped at Laura's shout, turning quickly. He could see nothing but the thick fog swallowing the road, but the red eyes remained fixed, glowing like embers in the dark. "What is it, Laura?" he asked, trying to hide his nervousness. "Behind you," she replied, pointing with the trembling camera. Before he could react, the red lights disappeared in the blink of an eye. Daniel ran back to the car, his heart racing. "It was just fog, right?" he said, trying to sound rational as he turned on his phone's flashlight. "I know what I saw," Laura retorted, her voice trembling. "That wasn't natural." Suddenly, a strange sound came from the depths of the forest, a low, rising hum, like the rustling of giant wings. The sound seemed to orbit around the car, growing louder. Laura looked around, pointing the camera at the fog, while Daniel desperately tried to restart the engine. "Come on, please," he murmured, turning the key without success. Then the white light returned, this time stronger, illuminating the car from the inside and momentarily blinding them. In the midst of the glare, Daniel and Laura heard something scraping against the metal, like claws scratching the bodywork. Laura screamed, dropping the camera. "Something's outside the car," she shouted, gripping Daniel's arm. The light faded suddenly, plunging everything into complete darkness. When Daniel finally managed to start the engine, he shifted into gear and accelerated, the sound of the engine echoing like a desperate scream on the empty road. But the car barely moved 20 meters when the light followed them again, now faster and more frantic, as if it were hunting them. "It's coming after us!" Laura yelled, holding the camera and trying to capture whatever she could. The light enveloped them once more, and this time the car began to falter. The headlights flickered, the engine sputtered, and the hum outside intensified. Daniel screamed in despair, "We can't escape this." Then the car suddenly stopped, as if an invisible force had yanked away all the power. They were completely isolated, trapped in the middle of the road. Around them, the fog seemed denser, almost solid. And then something terrible happened. The car doors began to unlock on their own, one by one. Laura held the button in a futile attempt to lock the doors again, but it was useless. The hum grew louder, now accompanied by a sound that resembled a low, distorted laugh. Daniel and Laura felt a presence outside the car, something they couldn't see clearly, but whose overwhelming pressure made the air feel heavy and suffocating. The camera, fallen on the seat, was still recording. It was then that a vague figure appeared in front of the car, tall, shrouded in dark mist, with two red lights in place of eyes. Daniel and Laura froze, unable to move, as the figure approached slowly. The presence around them seemed to invade their minds, filling them with strange, disconnected images, visions of other abandoned cars on the road, of missing drivers, of something dragging people into the void. "Don't look into its eyes," Laura whispered, as if something within her knew. "What?" Daniel asked, unable to tear his gaze away from the red lights. The environment seemed to freeze. The figure was now so close that its silhouette touched the hood. Laura closed her eyes, pulling Daniel while he still stared at the being, and then everything went silent. The silence on the road was terrifying, as if the world itself had held its breath. Laura, still gripping Daniel's arm, opened her eyes slowly. The being in front of the car had vanished, but the tension in the air persisted, as if something invisible was still watching them. "Daniel, don't look," she began, but stopped upon realizing he wasn't responding. Turning to him, Laura saw that Daniel's face was pale, and his eyes remained fixed on the empty space where the figure had been. It was as if he were in a trance, his lips trembling, murmuring incomprehensible words. "Daniel!" Laura shouted, shaking him forcefully. "Oh, look at me!" Finally he blinked, taking a deep breath as if waking from a nightmare. I saw things, Laura. Horrible things," he said, his voice trembling. "Bodies, abandoned cars, and they're still here." Before Laura could respond, the humming returned, louder and closer. The white light reappeared, this time encircling the car like a cyclone. Suddenly, the vehicle began to shake violently, as if invisible hands were pushing it from all sides. "We need to get out of here," Laura shouted, trying to open the door, but it was jammed. The humming grew even more intense until abruptly it ceased completely. The light vanished, and the car remained still. Everything was too quiet. It was then that they realized they were no longer on the road. Looking out the window, Laura saw they were in a clearing deep in the forest, surrounded by trees that appeared to bend toward the car, as if they were watching. "How did we end up here?" Daniel asked, his voice filled with panic. Laura tried to turn on her camera, but the screen showed only static. The same happened when she tried her phone. It was as if something was blocking all signals, isolating them completely. As they stepped out of the car, they both noticed the air was colder and the ground was covered in a creeping fog. There was no sound, no wind, no insects, nothing, just the sound of their own footsteps. Walking a little further, Laura found something that made her heart stop. A series of abandoned cars, covered in moss and rust, scattered throughout the clearing. Some seemed to have been there for decades. "Oh my God," she murmured. "These cars, they belong to the people who disappeared." Daniel, still in shock, pointed to something else. Deep marks in the ground, as if something gigantic had dragged the vehicles there. Before they could investigate further, the humming returned, now mixed with sounds resembling distant screams. The white lights appeared again, this time circling the clearing, closing in on them like predators hunting their prey. Suddenly, Daniel grabbed Laura by the arm. "Run!" The two began to sprint back to the car, but the lights were faster. One of them zipped past Laura, nearly knocking her over. Daniel looked back and saw indistinct figures again, tall, shrouded in mist, with red eyes, walking slowly toward them. "We're not going to make it!" Daniel yelled, but Laura pulled him with force. Reaching the car, they locked the doors and tried to start the engine again. For a moment, it seemed the vehicle was dead, but then, like a miracle, the engine roared to life. Daniel slammed on the accelerator, and the car sped through the clearing, crashing into branches and stones that appeared in their path. As they broke through the barrier of lights, the humming ceased, and the forest vanished behind them. They were back on the road, breathless and in shock. However, looking in the rearview mirror, Laura saw something that made her freeze again. One of the lights was following them at a distance, as if it was watching, waiting. The car sped along the winding snake pass, but the environment felt different. A dense fog enveloped the road like a suffocating blanket, making it seem endless. Laura kept glancing in the rearview mirror, seeing the white light pursuing them, maintaining a fixed distance, like a predator toying with its prey. "This isn't going to end, Daniel," she screamed, her voice trembling. "This thing isn't going to let us go." Daniel was sweating, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. "We need to find an exit. Maybe a town, a station, anywhere with people." "And if this is some kind of trap?" Laura asked, recalling the abandoned cars they had seen in the clearing. He hesitated, but didn't respond. The car continued to race down the road, headlights cutting through the fog. Then ahead, they spotted flashing lights. Daniel sighed in relief. "It must be a police station or an accident. Let's stop." As they approached, the lights became clearer. But what they expected to be a signal of help quickly revealed something even more terrifying. They weren't normal lights, but those same white orbs, floating in a circle, blocking the road. "No! No! No! No!" Daniel shouted, turning the steering wheel to try to make a U-turn, but the lights were now all around the car, surrounding them again. The engine began to fail once more, and the familiar humming filled the air. Laura clutched Daniel's arm tightly, tears streaming down her face. "If they want to catch us, why don't they just do it already? Why do they keep toying with us?" she screamed, her voice desperate. Daniel gritted his teeth, taking a deep breath to control his panic. "Maybe it's not just about us. Maybe they want to force us to do something." Laura looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. But all those visions, the lights, the cars, it's as if they want us to understand something." At that moment, something strange happened. The nearest light began to pulse, emitting an intermittent glow, almost like a pattern. It was hypnotic. Laura felt an almost irresistible urge to open the door, as if something was calling her. "No, Laura!" Daniel shouted, grabbing her before she could unlock the door. The light pulsed faster, and they both began to hear a distinct sound amid the humming. A voice, low and distorted, like a distant echo. "See what you've done." Laura and Daniel exchanged terrified glances. "Did you hear that?" she asked. Before he could respond, the lights receded slightly, opening a path on the road. Daniel hesitated, but Laura urged him on. "Let's go, before they change their minds." They sped down the corridor created by the lights, but something forced them to slow down. The humming hadn't disappeared, but now it was mixed with sounds reminiscent of old engines and screaming voices, like an echo of times past. Finally, they reached a more open section of the road, where the fog was less dense. Daniel stopped the car, panting, and looked around. There was no sign of the lights or the sound. "I think we made it," he began, but was interrupted by Laura, who was pointing at something on the ground. There, by the side of the road, was a marker, an improvised memorial with extinguished candles, wilted flowers, and a weathered plaque with names engraved. Laura stepped out of the car, despite Daniel's protests, and approached it. When she read the names, her hands trembled. This was an accident. Daniel stepped out as well, looking at the scene. A nearby plaque displayed a yellowed newspaper headline encased in plastic. "Fatal collision on Snake Pass. 8 dead in accident involving truck and 2 smaller vehicles." "Could it be the lights are those people?" Laura whispered. It was at that moment the lights reappeared, this time further away, forming a sort of circle around the memorial. The humming returned, but now it seemed less aggressive. It was as if they wanted the couple to understand something. Daniel stared at the lights and murmured, "Maybe they are trapped here, trapped in this cycle of pain." Laura placed her hand on his shoulder, sensing an invisible weight in the air. "And we are next?" The lights began to move again, forming a tight circle around Laura, Daniel, and the memorial. The hum returned with full force, now nearly deafening. The air felt heavier, making even breathing difficult. "They won't let us go, Daniel," Laura said, gripping his arm tightly. Daniel, breathless, felt the desperation rise. He looked around, trying to find a solution. "So, what do they want from us? What are we doing here?" That was when one of the lights broke away from the circle and stopped directly in front of them. It pulsed, emitting quick and hypnotic flashes, as if trying to communicate. Laura stared at the light, feeling something strange. Memories that were not hers invaded her mind. She saw fragmented images of a horrific accident. A truck losing control on a bend, crashing into two smaller cars. People screaming. Bodies being dragged along the road, and then silence, complete silence, followed by a blinding white light. "Oh my God," Laura whispered, falling to her knees. "They can't move on. They're trapped here, reliving it all." Daniel knelt beside her, eyes wide. "And what can we do? We're not mediums. We don't know how to help." At that moment, the light pulsed even more intensely, and the voices echoed again, this time clearer. "Witness our end." The words seemed to pierce their minds. Laura looked at Daniel, understanding dawning on her. "They want us to tell the story, for someone to know what happened, so they can finally rest." Daniel shook his head. "But how? The accident has already been recorded. It's all here." He pointed to the memorial plaque. Before they could think any further, the hum reached a deafening peak, and all the lights converged into a single bright beam, illuminating the area as if it were day. The ground began to vibrate, and an invisible force pushed them backward. "Laura!" Daniel shouted, holding onto her as she struggled to maintain her balance. The beam of light shot up into the sky, but before it vanished completely, it left one last vision. The faces of the people who had died in the accident, looking at the couple with expressions that mixed sadness and relief. And then silence returned. The lights disappeared, the road was empty again, and the hum ceased entirely. Laura and Daniel stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, still feeling the weight of the presence that had just departed. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "Are they gone?" Laura nodded, but tears filled her eyes. "Yes, I think we managed to free them." They returned to the car, but as Daniel turned on the engine, he hesitated. "Let's leave this behind, right? Move on?" Laura glanced at the camera sitting on the seat, still functioning. "No, we need to tell what happened. Maybe others who pass through here will finally understand what this road carries." Daniel didn't reply. He merely pressed the accelerator. As they left Snake Pass, the fog began to dissipate, and for the first time that night, the road seemed just a road, not a haunted place. But in the distance, as they drove away, Laura saw a small point of light flickering by the roadside, like a final goodbye. The car descended the winding road in a heavy silence. Laura and Daniel, exhausted, exchanged occasional glances, but neither had the courage to speak about what they had just experienced. The flickering light seen in the rearview mirror lingered in their minds, a final reminder that Snake Pass was not just an ordinary road. Eventually, they arrived in the town of Glossop, where they stopped at a small 24-hour cafe. The fluorescent light of the place seemed almost alien after the oppressive darkness of the road. As they sat down, Laura picked up the camera and began to review what she had recorded. "Do you think we captured anything?" Daniel asked, stirring his cup of tea with still trembling hands. Laura shook her head. "I don't know, but we need to see." As they watched the footage, the screen showed scenes that seemed normal at first. The fog-covered road, headlights cutting through the darkness, and then the moment the lights appeared. Laura pressed pause. "Here," she whispered. When they slowly advanced the footage, the figure shrouded in mist with red eyes appeared. Daniel nearly knocked over his tea. This is real. It's there. Further along in the recording, the beam of light pulsed, and distorted voices could be heard, albeit weaker than what they had experienced live. "I think we have enough to tell their story, Daniel," Laura said, her voice grave. "Now it's our responsibility." In the following days, the couple put together a detailed video for their channel, combining the captured images with the information they had found about the accident on Snake Pass. They spoke about the memorial, the abandoned cars, and the overwhelming feeling of pain that still lingered on the road. When the video went live, comments began to flood in quickly. Some people reported similar experiences: cars failing, mysterious lights, frightening sounds. Others were skeptical, accusing the couple of sensationalism. But among the messages, one caught Laura's attention. An anonymous user had written, "I lost my father in that accident. Thank you for showing that they were still there. It means a lot to me." Laura fell silent as she read that, feeling a mix of sadness and relief. She showed the message to Daniel, who embraced her tightly. "We did the right thing," he said. Even so, the impact of the experience marked them deeply. Daniel began to avoid driving at night, and Laura had recurring nightmares about lights following her. They never returned to Snake Pass. Months later, Laura received an unexpected email. It was from a production company interested in adapting their story into a documentary about haunted locations. Daniel hesitated to accept, but Laura knew this was their last chance to give a voice to the victims of Snake Pass. On the night of the documentary's premiere, as they watched at home, a detail they hadn't noticed before appeared in the footage. A reflection in the white light, almost imperceptible, showed smiling faces, as if they had finally found peace. Laura smiled, feeling a lightness she hadn't felt in months. "They are gone, Daniel. They're finally free." Daniel held her hand and looked out the window at the calm night. "And so are we." As the TV screen darkened, the familiar sound of a low hum seemed to echo in the background.